that one of them was said to be surprised the building had collapsed around them. And this morning, reports that at least one other police officer had also been pulled out alive. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani this morning.
We were able to move 120 dump trucks out of the city last night, which will give you a sense of the work that was done overnight. So some of the debris has already been removed. More of it is being removed, and it'll be done by barge all throughout the day today.
And the question on everyone's mind, how many died? The mayor says he is preparing for the worst.
The numbers that we're working on are in the thousands. Obviously, we hope that's not the case.
At the city's hospitals, the hope is there would be more survivors to treat.
They told me the story of how they've had physicians down at ground zero at the site. One person was trapped and they thought they'd have to amputate his leg. And they were able to get him out without doing that, and he is alive and here thanks to that tremendous dedication.
And that police officer rescued this morning, word now of his heroic effort to save others before he himself became trapped.
He said that as soon as they discovered him, that the EMS personnel at the scene were doing an outstanding job of comforting him. They were giving him water to drink. They were doing, he said, a great job of trying to get him out of the scene, but it was very difficult, very dangerous. He was actually pinned for quite a while until they were able to get him out.
This morning at the Pentagon, the all-night effort merely to extinguish the fires is still underway.
We were never able to fully extinguish the fire in the roof structure. We were able to get it mostly knocked down, and again, because we're having extreme difficulty making access under the slate roof, it's to be expected to take a while to get there. We have had the fuel from the jet catch fire again, and we're now in there with some additional hand lines and some phone lines with aircraft firefighters inside of the insides of the Pentagon, trying to suppress it, this time with firefighting foam.
And even as the struggle to contain the fires continues, the death count begins. Word this morning that the number would exceed 100, mostly from the Army and Navy, and some intelligence personnel. From the White House this morning, another address from the president.
The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. This will require our country to unite in steadfast determination and resolve. Freedom and democracy are under attack. The American people need to know we're facing a different enemy than we have ever faced. This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life.
As he did last night, the president seeks to reassure Americans that life would go on, but it is going to be different.
The federal government and all our agencies are conducting business, but it is not business as usual. We are operating on heightened security alert. America is going forward, and as we do so, we must remain keenly aware of the threats to our country. Those in authority should take appropriate precautions to protect our citizens.
Across the nation, it is clear things are far from normal. This morning, air travel still shut down, stock markets closed, sporting events postponed, Broadway shows dark, and U.S. military forces worldwide on high alert. Warships patrolling the waters off Washington and New York, AWACS radar planes patrolling the skies. As rescuers toil, another high-stakes effort is underway to find those responsible for the carnage. NBC's Chris Hansen reports investigators are making swift progress.
Authorities may have identified some of the actual hijackers, and here's how they think they might have done that. Yesterday, they got a phone call from a passenger who had left Logan and arrived at his destination. Of course, he saw on the television monitors what had happened at the World Trade Center. He called investigators to say that he had had an altercation with two men he described as being Arabic in the central parking garage near the American Airlines terminal here at Boston Logan. He described the car that they were near, which was turned out to be a rental car, a Mitsubishi sedan. Investigators arrived at the sedan, took a quick look, and they found inside that there were flight training manuals in Arabic. They were able to connect that sedan to two men who are now identified as brothers, both of whom who have passports from the United Arab Emirates, one of whom is a trained pilot. 2 to 3 other suspects may have come across the border into the U.S. from Canada and flown here yesterday morning from Portland, Maine, to take part in the hijackings.
And today in Florida, FBI agents spend hours questioning instructors at a flight school and confiscating potential evidence. Their focus, 2 men described as Middle Eastern who trained at the school last year. By midday, reports that the FBI has connected the 2 with yesterday's terrorist acts. NBC's Kerry Sanders reports the Florida angle is developing quickly.
They enrolled last July into the Venice Flying School, and they really completed their training there in January.
The investigation picks up pace this afternoon, with SWAT teams moving into this hotel in Boston, the city where 2 of the hijacked flights originated. Authorities reportedly looking for material witnesses, people who might have had contact with the growing list of suspects.
They believe they are linked to yesterday's attack. They say that credit cards that these men possess were allegedly used to purchase tickets on flights.
There are local news reports, unconfirmed, of 3 arrests. All we know is 1 person is taken away in a van, and it is unclear this afternoon what, if any, role he had in yesterday's attacks.
And federal investigators are confirming that they do believe that there is an actual terrorist cell here in the Boston area with direct links to Osama bin Laden.
As the search for suspects heats up, distraught family members search for loved ones. Thousands of people still unaccounted for at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, where hope for any survivors now seems to have all but disappeared. In New York, a long line of anxious Americans outside the city's Family Services Center.
Didn't really hit me until just now, you know.
I haven't heard from everybody, and it doesn't even, you know, it's like everybody knows somebody, and we're just all in this together, no matter who we are or what our beliefs are.
And from the families and friends of the passengers on the hijacked planes, heartbreaking stories of heroism and bravery. Tom Burnett, a passenger on the United flight that crashed outside Pittsburgh, called his wife, says Father Frank Calaccio, a friend of the family.
Yeah, he called her on the cell phone and told her that one of the passengers was already dead and that they knew that they were all going to die, and that 2 other men and he were going to try to do something, the conversation, and love you, honey. And that was the end of the conversation.
The speculation today that Burnett and his comrades were successful in bringing down the plane short of the hijackers' intended target in this western Pennsylvania field instead of a Washington landmark. On the same plane, Mark Bingham called his aunt and mother.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
He said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I hope it was quick. I hope he took an active part in thwarting the hijackers.
As the day wears on, fresh evidence of the magnitude of this disaster. Pictures released by NASA show the Trade Center fires so large they could be seen from space. And on this day after the towers collapsed, more scenes of absolute devastation. At 2:30, Secretary of State Powell gives a briefing. He makes it clear that not only the United States, but its allies around the world will be seeking the perpetrators. But as of now, no hard answers.
We have to make sure that we go after terrorism and get it by its branch and root. And so we will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Later this afternoon, more unsettling news that the White House may have been the initial target of the plane that hit the Pentagon. NBC's Jim Miklashevsky.
That it circled up over the Capitol and then headed down toward the White House, in the direction of the White House.
White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer confirms that account, also telling reporters that the president himself was a target, even as he flew with a fighter escort to those military bases yesterday.
That also is one of the reasons why Air Force One did not come back to Andrews, where some people may have thought it would.
There was also troubling news of a different sort today. the first reports of retaliation against Arab Americans. This mosque outside of Dallas, Texas, attacked. Its windows shot out. And New York's mayor registered concern on that front as well.
But we've had a few incidents that appear to have been directed against people because they may be regarded as Arab or Asian, but nobody should attack anyone else.
The mayor also provided the latest numbers on casualties.
We so far have a body count of 55 people as of about a half hour ago. We were able to take out another person about 3 hours ago, 3 hours ago, a woman who was found still alive, taken to the hospital. So now there are at least 4 people that we've been able to take out.
But with so many people still missing, no one expects the death count to stay so low. Hospitals prepared for a second wave of survivors today find themselves instead waiting. In Washington, Attorney General John Ashcroft outlines some of the facts of the hijackings. It's a chilling recitation.
The 4 planes were hijacked by between 3 and 6 individuals per plane, using knives and box cutters, and in some cases making bomb threats. Our government has credible evidence that the White House and Air Force One were targets. A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
Then at 5:15, another echo of the devastation as the remains of the South Twin Tower collapses and another skyscraper near Ground Zero begins to crack.
Yeah, the building is halfway gone and the rest of it is coming down.
At day's end, President Bush arrives at the Pentagon, an emotional visit by the Commander-in-Chief to inspect the damage and pay his respects to those who suffered some of the first casualties of this newest war. Night falls on a city and a country transformed. Tuesday, a day of horror. Today, in this city at Ground Zero, a day of stunned reflection. Stunned is also the word to describe the reaction of both U.S. senators from New York, Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton, after they surveyed the damage in lower Manhattan today. And there is also word from Washington that President Bush plans to come here. The exact timing has not yet been determined. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. Dateline Stone Phillips tonight in the heart of New York City in Times Square. We're going to go back to Washington now. Our Washington bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press is Tim Russert. Tim, understandably, the attention of this country is focused on lower Manhattan, the Pentagon, where they're still trying to remove the rubble and the bodies of those people who were caught in that attack, and on the Oval Office, the State Department, and the Defense Secretary's office. But there's other business to be done in this country at some time. How long can it be suspended?
Quite some time, Tom. You know, the whole debate over the so-called Social Security surplus, who would spend it, the president said only during a war or recession. We now have both. The Democrats and Republicans and the President of the United States are embarking on a plan to provide disaster relief and war preparation that will cost tens of billions of dollars, and no one's complaining.
Describe for us the political climate on Capitol Hill today as opposed to, say, just a week ago, Tim.
Night and day, Tom. People bickering about lock boxes, that's all vanished. It now is America under attack. Who is our enemy, and how do we retaliate? Tom, people want a disproportionate retaliation. They want to send a message. They realize, however, how difficult it will be, and also the ramifications or consequences if we strike back at Afghanistan or a country like that. What will it mean in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt? Will it cause incitement in those countries? Very, very complicated. Tom, the White House is working also very hard to underscore how much they thought these planes may have threatened the actual White House. NBC News has learned tonight that the Secret Service physically went into Dick Cheney's office and said, "We are moving now." This is when they learned the plane that left Dulles was heading towards the Pentagon was in fact circling over the White House. And one other interesting note, Tom, we've also learned at NBC that there was a President Bush in the White House during the morning of these events. His father, former President Bush, was actually at the White House the morning of the attack.
And I'm told as well, Tim, that when he left for Minneapolis in a speaking engagement, that the Secret Service insisted that his trip not be completed. Is that true?
Absolutely, Tom. They were quite nervous about him taking part and being engaged in U.S. airspace. A full-scale alert, no doubt about it. They understand now that they must retaliate. They believe they have the unity of the Congress, the unity of the American people, but it's going to take time. It's delicate and complicated, and it has enormous, enormous fallout for not only the Middle East, but the rest of the world.
When they moved Dick Cheney from his office in the White House, where did they move him?
Tom, to a, quote, secure area. They will not comment whether that's inside or outside the White House. The fact is there are facilities within the White House that are extremely secure, that can withstand even an airplane attack. There are also areas in the vicinity of the White House they say can do the same.
All right, thanks very much, Tim Russert, who's our Washington Bureau Chief. Joining me now is Republican Senator John McCain, who serves on the Armed Services Committee, a leading Republican on Capitol Hill, and of course a decorated war veteran. Senator McCain, let me ask you, first of all, what is your assessment of what the administration has been doing today?
I think they've made significant progress, both in process of identifying who was responsible, and also particularly Secretary Powell deserves great credit for unifying our NATO allies, and is now reaching out to other friends to make sure that they're all completely with us in whatever we do.
Sad fact is that we're likely to have a very high death toll, and once this country gets past its shock and its grief, it's not unexpected that there could be a volcanic eruption of rage in America, but this is likely to go on for some time in terms of military options.
Well, I think that's why those of us that are looked up to, especially the president, is going to explain to the American people that this is going to be a long, hard struggle. Even if tomorrow we eliminated Mr. bin Laden and his organization, there are other organizations in the world today who are bent on the destruction of the United States of America. This is a long struggle, and it's going to require significant expenditure of American treasure and, unfortunately, perhaps expenditure of American blood.
You were a warrior during the height of the Cold War. We're now in a wholly different kind of a war. Are we going to have to rethink how we reorganize our military and deploy it around the world?
Without a doubt. It's long overdue since the end of the Cold War, and we haven't made the much needed reforms. A lot of it is due to pork barreling right here in the Congress as we speak, but now's our opportunity. I think the American people will support such reform, and it's very badly needed, and we can achieve it.
We have learned recently that there's not much appetite in this country, understandably, for ground action in these military operations that put the men on the ground at risk. For example, in Kosovo, there were no ground troops. Everything was conducted from the air. It seems unlikely, to me at least, that you can have a successful war against terrorism without committing ground troops in some fashion.
I think the biggest mistake of the Kosovo conflict was when we ruled out the use of ground troops. I don't know what scenario will be required, whether it's with or without ground troops, but I think the president and the American government and the American people have to say to these terrorists, we'll do whatever is necessary, and that includes all options.
Senator John McCain, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you. Senator McCain told me earlier, by the way, that he's doing just fine in terms of his health. We want to share that information with you as well tonight. Joining me now is Democratic Senator Joe Biden, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, same question for you that I began with Senator McCain. What is your assessment of how the administration is organizing its efforts in the first 48 hours?
I just spoke with Secretary Powell. I think they're doing an incredible job in getting a consensus here. Tom, for the first time in the history of NATO passed a resolution, the so-called NAC, the group that makes these decisions, as you know, passed a resolution saying this is an Article 5 action, meaning that an attack against one is an attack against all. Translated, if we can show, which we will be able to, that this was an asset from outside of the United States that did this, that they will join us in pursuing the aggressor. This is a big deal. Secondly, we have had significant input from moderate Arab states who I believe, and I think the Secretary will be able to put together, will be supportive of whatever action we take. China and Russia have expressed in a way they never have before, because they understand their growing vulnerability, the willingness to deal with these folks and whatever state is harboring them. This is an opportunity. People have talking about, Tom, about our way of life ending. Wrong. The way of life of organized terrorist cells is about to end. They crossed the line.
They crossed the line. And the civilized world, I predict you, is going to respond, and I compliment Secretary Powell on beginning this organizational effort.
Senator Biden, I remember very well on the eve of Operation Desert Storm in the Senate, there was a very spirited debate and a very close vote about whether the Senate would support then-President George Bush the 41st in his efforts to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Do you expect anything like that kind of divisive debate?
Absolutely not, Tom. And Tom, if I may say, you asked John a question. John's a close friend. You asked him a question about we wouldn't put troops on the ground in Kosovo. John and I were the ones that had the resolution saying put troops on the ground in Kosovo. This is not Kosovo. The American people have been attacked. There will be overwhelming support. The military understands. The people understand. I would be dumbfounded if a single person would argue against using military ground forces if that is deemed to be necessary.
And this military operation, as Senator McCain and others have indicated today, the American public has to be aware of the fact that it could go on for some time.
Yes, well, by the way, it may go on sporadically, but Tom, we have an opportunity here, if we do this well, and I think we will, to actually unite the world in dealing with this so we can begin to end the possibility of large-scale terrorist organizations having the succor and support of other nations. I mean, everybody has to understand. For example, the Pakistanis have to understand they got to pick sides now. Everybody's got to pick a side, Tom. Off the sidelines, period. And I think that's going to happen. This has never happened in the whole second half of the 20th century. This is a seminal moment. And I think every once in a while, Tom, some group, some individual, some nation goes so far that they crossed every line. The terrorist organization involved here crossed the line, and I think they've signed their death warrant and the death warrant for the ability of these kinds of cells to exist with the support of other nations.
Thank you so much, Senator Joe Biden, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under the new reorganization in which the Democrats have the majority, reflecting some of the passion that is felt across party lines tonight. There was a memorial service tonight on the steps of the Capitol shortly before Senators McCain and Biden appeared with us. The nation today, in fact, the world, stared in disbelief as mighty American symbols tumbled to the ground, American citizens still stunned at the sophistication, the complexity, and the coordination of this attack. It was not a random act of a lone terrorist, obviously, but a carefully planned catastrophe executed with alarming precision, cold-blooded calculation. Dateline's John Hockenberry has some of the frightening details.
It fits into a pattern, deadly, effective. The Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen last year, and even the U.S. Embassy attacks in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania. In each case, we find a shocking U.S. vulnerability exposed by calculating, suicidal killers looking for a way in. Into a parking garage, past a checkpoint, or right up to the side of a Navy ship supposedly on alert.
This attack fits that pattern. But experts agree it also reaches a whole new level of sophistication. As details become clear, there is a degree of cold-blooded calculation here, a calculation of U.S. vulnerability that is quite simply staggering.
The calculation extends from airport security in 3 separate cities, to the cockpits of 4 separate airplanes, to the entire civilian air traffic control system, right down to the understanding of exactly what it would take to bring down a marvel of engineering, a global landmark like the Twin Towers. Investigators need to try to see what the terrorists apparently saw at Boston's Logan Airport and elsewhere that gave them confidence that hijackers, armed apparently with knives, could safely board 4 separate jets simultaneously.
What we're talking about is not only having the people have a good understanding of security at our various airports, have those people in a coordinated effort get into those airports, be ticketed to get on board of aircraft that were fully fueled for cross-country flights, and have personnel that were trained in how to fly those aircraft.
Once aboard, the terrorists had an absolute and an apparently unprecedented confidence that they could take control of the planes.
They had a good understanding of what the procedures were on board the aircraft based on the reports that the stewardesses were used to lure the crew out of the cockpit.
More amazing, perhaps, these terrorists also understood how to turn off their plane's radio transponders, giving them, in effect, a cloak of invisibility as they deviated from their flight paths and headed for their intended targets.
This is considerably more sophisticated in terms of access to the aircraft, understanding the crew's procedures, ability to fly the aircraft, and understanding our air traffic control systems.
To pull this off, the choice of planes was hardly random. The Boeing 757 and 767 are different planes, but they have identical cockpits with sophisticated autopilots. To the terrorists, this apparently meant that once they had control of the planes, the pilots were expendable. In fact, as Attorney General John Ashcroft told the nation today, the hijackers were essentially the pilots.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
That training is readily available. A cursory survey of the aviation industry by Dateline shows that training, even with sophisticated simulators for the 757 and 767, is obtainable throughout the world. Aviation sources told Dateline today that there are perhaps 70 places with simulators for the hijacked planes. But they also say the expertise exhibited here was even obtainable from desktop computers and flight manuals. In Florida, investigators say they are looking at 2 people who apparently received pilot training and whose names were found on the manifest of the hijacked planes. The flights were well chosen by these terrorists. All 4 bound for the West Coast, loaded with fuel. The 767 weighs 160 tons, including 45 tons of jet fuel fully loaded. A 757 weighs 100 tons with 30 tons of jet fuel. Both planes dwarf the explosive power of the now tiny fuel oil bomb that tore off the face of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Finally, whoever planned this attack knew a decisive detail about the physics of tall buildings.
The energy required to bring it down is already stored in the structure in the form of potential energy. All the energy used to raise those construction materials into place in the late 60s and early 70s when they built the structure is there if you could just find a way to release it and let gravity take over.
Mark Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition. Release a building's stored energy, he says, its collapse becomes a matter not of terrorism, but the laws of physics.
You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Yet the impact of the planes alone did not cause that failure. In fact, tall building designers try to anticipate air accidents.
When this structure was designed, it was designed, to the best of my understanding, to take the impact of what was then the state-of-the-art airplane being used in our country, the Boeing 707. And if you noticed that when the planes impacted Towers 1 and Tower 2, the structure stood.
As time progressed, what was clear to anyone in New York City or to the millions of people watching the horror unfold on television, fire was engulfing the building. The worst enemy of a steel-reinforced structure is heat, extreme heat. Physics professor and explosives expert Van Romero.
At what point was there no chance of survival, do you think?
Once the fire starts inside the building, once the building structure itself, the materials inside that building start to burn, it can race through the building faster than you can run.
Engineers suspect the temperatures inside the crash areas could have quickly reached well over 1,000 degrees, perhaps approaching 2,000 degrees, beyond the melting point of any steel. The heat would have obliterated the insulation around the structure, the fire suppression system. Once this happened, nothing could save the Twin Towers.
When the plane hits the building, the kinetic energy, if you will, or the momentum of the plane hitting the building is actually pretty small compared to the fuel. When the fuel explodes from the jet fuel that's on the airplane, that can really have much more devastating effect on the building itself.
As engineers look at what happened to the building yesterday, they see that the window of escape was in fact tiny. The chance of survival had everything to do with where and when people started their escapes in relation to the crucial impact areas where the planes hit. It took at least 15 minutes for people to make it from the 80th floor to ground level. Those people left the building as it was collapsing.
We were up the escalator about to go out the door when the building collapsed.
If I didn't leave the minute that I left, I would be dead.
For those who waited or were above the area of the crash damage, there was perhaps no escape. In looking at the rubble in Lower Manhattan, it's as though someone was trying to learn from the much less devastating World Trade Center bombing back in 1993. Experts say this attack seems to suggest someone learned those lessons very well.
They did their homework. Even if there was no secondary explosives in the building, hitting the having the airplane hit the building where it did, a large amount of weight above the damaged location, that damaged location being further damaged by the fire, that structure could no longer support the weight above it, and the collapse ensues.
There may eventually be new lessons from this attack for builders, engineers, and designers. Certainly the security of every airport, the entire air traffic control system, even the ability of air passengers to take bathroom breaks will be different from now on.
Perhaps the most chilling realization here is how low-tech this attack was in the end. No sophisticated missiles, no stolen nukes, no exotic biowarfare or chemical agents. The main decisive weapon here was determination. This attack was a reminder that comparatively simple techniques in the hands of a totally determined terrorist with the right knowledge, sufficient resources on the right day, as we all saw, is more than enough to strike deep into the heart of the most powerful nation in the world.
And tonight we're looking live at the scene in Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center, the collapse of all but a few stories of the Twin Towers. We're looking at it now from across the river in New Jersey, across New York Harbor. On most evenings until yesterday morning, that was one of the most stunning sights in any urban landscape anywhere in the world. Now, it is, of course, a scene of utter devastation. It is racing against hope that we can find any more survivors in there. There may be as many as 10, 15, 20,000 people who went down with those two towers when they collapsed after they had been hit by the plane. And we're told by people who have been down there, state officials and other reporters, that it's hard to describe how compacted the debris is. When they came down so hard, hundreds of thousands of tons of rubble, and that's all been packed together, so there's very little hope that there can be much airspace in any of that wreckage. As we have been telling you for 2 days now, much of the investigation into the attacks is focusing on Osama bin Laden, a terrorist leader who has been monitored for years, and yet he remains a confounding and deeply enigmatic figure to so many, cold-blooded and calculating. With more on the mind of bin Laden, here's Dateline's Jane Pauley tonight. Jane?
Well, thanks, Tom. The one thing you may think you know for sure about the hideous atrocities wreaked upon this country yesterday is that it had to have been the work of madmen. Who else could conceive of a plot to kill so many innocent people, or to execute that plan by deliberately immolating yourself along with them in the fiery crash? But it could be a big mistake to underestimate the likes of such men as Osama bin Laden.
I don't think he's crazy. He is devious, he is clever, he is relentless, and he is patient.
But he is not a madman.
But he is not a madman.
Judith Miller is a reporter for the New York Times. She's covered the Arab world since 1983, when she was chief of the Times Cairo bureau. Is calling this even fanaticism too simplistic?
Fanatic is actually a very good word to describe them. They are highly motivated, they are highly disciplined, and we underestimate them at our peril.
Understanding them is critical too. What would motivate a young man, average age of a suicide bomber is 22, to sacrifice his life as an unknown number did yesterday?
I think despair is partly responsible for this wave of suicide bombings.
Because they have nowhere else.
Because they have nowhere else to go. I mean, I have interviewed so many of these young people with so much hope for the future and so few prospects.
Especially the educated ones.
Especially the educated ones.
Dr. Gerald Post is a professor of political psychology at George Washington University. He's also a psychiatrist.
These people are distinctly not psychologically disturbed. In fact,
interestingly, psychiatrically disturbed individuals are expelled from the groups because they're considered a security risk.
Many say it's a perversion of Islam, that the Quran condemns suicide. But radical Islamic sects do not call it suicide. In their interpretation, not to act is immoral.
The motivation for these acts is both religious and social. And the social motivation is a fusion of nationalism and radical Islam.
What did America do to unleash this hell upon us?
Well, according to Osama bin Laden, we defiled sacred Saudi and Islamic soil.
When?
In 1990 and 91, when we sent American and international troops to defend his country against Iraqi soldiers.
Just as the Soviets had defiled Islamic soil in Afghanistan in 1979. Financed in part by his money, the Mujahideen then drove the Soviets out. He needed an enemy.
But he needed an enemy, precisely, and he also had an enemy because the Palestinian people were being, quote, oppressed, and it was the duty of all Muslims to come and rescue them, and the Arab countries were being, quote, oppressed by autocratic, horrible rulers whose rule he also wanted to terminate, and he felt that by mobilizing and training Arabs all over the world and Muslims from all over the world, he could accomplish this.
Bin Laden and other radical factions of Islam frighten many in the Arab world too. They may not represent mainstream Muslims, but they are determined and well-financed. But Judith Miller argues that to persist in seeing them as crazy fanatics is dangerous.
We have to get rid of this image of these people as kind of wild-eyed fanatics who are disorganized and can't get their act together.
Why do we have to?
I think if we don't discard these images and stereotypes, we will underestimate the enemy.
What is it about the American psyche that may be undermining our own interests?
I think sometimes any democracy is ill-equipped because we are open. That is our trademark. We are ill-equipped to fight people who are looking constantly for our weaknesses, for our vulnerabilities, for ways in which we can be hurt.
And joining us now from Washington is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Madam Secretary, the Clinton administration was so successful in arranging peace for Bosnia and executing an air war against Kosovo, but does it now seem clear to you that you greatly underestimated the threat of terrorism in this country, particularly Osama bin Laden?
I don't think we underestimated it, Tom. I think we understood the difficulty of it. We were clearly under threat. I had a lot of wonderful days as Secretary of State, but my worst day was when those embassies went down in Kenya and Tanzania. We worked to deal with it as best we could, and I think that what it will require is incredible determination now to deal with the issue beyond what we were able to do internationally. And I must say that I'm very supportive of what President Bush and Secretary Powell are doing in getting support for international action.
But should you have begun that international action at that time? There were two retaliatory strikes, one in Sudan, one in the subcontinent. Some question about the appropriateness of the target in the Sudan.
Well, first of all, I think that we did everything that we could. I believe we did the right thing in the target in Sudan. And this is a very different proposition. America itself has been attacked on our own soil, and it is unfortunate that it takes this kind of a horrific act to get people mobilized. I have no question that we did what we could, and we need to support this administration now in doing what it can. And the determination that Judith Miller talks about that the terrorists have, we have to have the same determination. Okay. And I have very much been following and read your book and everything that has been talked about in terms of the generation that saved us from the scourge of the evil of World War II. And we now have to exhibit the same bravery that those people did.
Madam Secretary, I do think that it's fair to say that there was not much political will in either party during the Clinton administration to commit the resources that were going to be required, diplomatic, militarily, and economic, to fight terrorism. But let's now try to go forward from here if we can. What are the greatest challenges to the administration in building this international coalition of allies? Are they the moderate Arab states?
Well, I think that clearly there is a question how they will behave. And I think that they are in a difficult position since there are extremists within their ranks and that they are concerned about. But they have to understand that they are just as much threatened by terrorism as the rest of us are. And I think, as Senator Biden said, it is important now for countries to make clear where they stand. We are all threatened by this, and I think we have to be very careful not to just decide that all Arab countries or Islam is responsible for this. This is a group of determined extremists who have their own agenda.
There was such a great deterioration of the situation in Israel before all of this happened. Is there any hope whatsoever for the peace process there?
Well, ultimately, it is the only way that we're going to be able to deal with this. And I am so regretful that we were not able to bring that peace process to a useful conclusion during our time. I think that we cannot live in a world where this kind of terrorism is possible and where we don't continue to have hope and peace. This has been a terrible day where we have really all had to and willingly identify with the victims and their families. And America has to stand tall. We have to remain calm. We have to be determined, and we have to bring allies and friends along. But ultimately, this is our responsibility. America was hit.
Thank you so much, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Thanks for joining us tonight, Madam Secretary. And joining us now is NBC's Campbell Brown. She's at the White House. She has more on the options that are being considered there. But Campbell, it's pretty clear tonight that President George Bush the 43rd is using the model of President George Bush the 41st in building a strong international coalition before any military options are executed.
Absolutely, Tom. They're being very careful not to talk about specific retaliatory options, but we are seeing a strategy emerge from these national security meetings the president is having. And what national security sources say is that's really their only option right now in terms of immediate action they can take to focus on trying to build support in the international community for whatever course of action the president chooses. The president today, we heard that in his remarks, as he defined this as really an attack on the world. And White House officials have been quick to point out the constant contact he's been having with world leaders. He spoke twice today with Russian President Putin, speaking with President Zhang. He's been in close contact with British Prime Minister Tony Blair and Canadian Prime Minister Chrétien. But what's interesting, Tom, based on the information we've been given about who the president's in contact with, he has not reached out directly